Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Tonic Accord podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about the paradox of intolerance. This states that unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance to even those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and the tolerance with them. To put it simply, or simplier, I guess, too much tolerance will then allow for the intolerant to take over. So the paradox is, to promote a tolerant society, you must be intolerant of intolerance. We're going to take a look today on what that kind of means in application. Is the paradox still applied today? Why has this been used by both the left and the right to criticize each other? And how can we maybe tweak the theory a little bit? So let's get right into it. My name is Drew. I'm joined by my friend and co-host Alex. We are both, have political science degrees. So we're not just, talking out of our ass. Sometimes we are, but we like to think we aren't. We do want to talk about this one because I think it plays into a lot of what we're seeing today with cancel culture, what we're seeing today with fake news and kind of radicalization of the U.S. political system. And I think this has a lot to do and a lot of good insight on our society. So Alex, how do you view the paradox of intolerance? Is there a paradox of intolerance today?
I do think so. And my opinions have kind of evolved on this probably since a year ago when we did that deplatforming episode with Grayson Forsberg.
Yeah.
And, about a year ago, and still part of me is this. I think naturally I lean libertarian on a lot of things where I don't know if big government or even laws are always the first way to solve a giant issue. But the more I think about it is that it's kind of like the frog in boiling water metaphor when it comes to intolerance in a society, right? Because the more that ideas go unchallenged, the more likely they're going to seep into the mainstream. And I think so, I guess to get it off the bat is that I think what a lot of people, and I've seen this on social media from my conservative friends and my liberal friends, actually more my liberal friends, is that they say, I've seen this, paradox of tolerance posted actually quite a lot, like I said, for my more progressive friends. And they kind of seem to think that you need to kind of limit or almost outlaw hate speech. And kind of what I get from Karl Popper and this whole idea is less limiting all hate speech, but it's more having the ability to criticize it and almost be critical of it. And that's where I stand on it, is that I think that all speech in theory should be allowed. There needs to be a critical examination of this speech. And so I think through history, it's more when this speech goes unchecked, unbridled, is when now we see a problem. And I think that's almost the balancing beam that we need to kind of find here, is that, do you allow hateful ideas to be expressed? Do you limit them, or do you allow them but also maybe put an asterisk with them and make sure to condemn them? And I don't have a perfect answer for this, but it is interesting to see how other countries have handled it, because the United States is actually more of the exception to the rule on allowing hate speech and just free speech in general to go pretty much free and unbridled. And a lot of Europe, Canada, and most of the world actually has a lot of strict laws on limiting hate speech. And I want to get into that later, but that's kind of my feeling, is that I don't think we should completely outlaw intolerance, but we need to keep it checked because there's that frog in boiling water.
Yeah, so I see this is kind of the picture that I saw that sparked the reason I wanted to talk about this. It's been passed around social media a lot, and it really boils down what Karl Popper said almost too much. I think it oversimplifies his theory here. Because, it says here, should a tolerant society tolerate intolerance? And it has, these Nazis, of course, right? Everyone goes straight to Nazis. It says the answer is no, right? And he talks about the paradox, and he says, any movement that preaches intolerance or persecution must be outside of the law. This paradox also assumes defending tolerance requires to not tolerate the intolerant. I think this is an oversimplification of what Karl Popper was trying to say. So first of all, given context, he wrote about this paradox very briefly in his book, I think it's called Open Societies and Its Enemies. And this was published in 1945, just after World War II. So certainly, coming out of a world that just saw an insane amount of intolerance lead to genocide. But in this photo, they just simplify it as, should a tolerant society tolerate intolerance? He says the answer is no. That oversimplifies what I think he actually said, which, he talked about. He says here, this is his words now. I do not imply, for instance, that we should always suppress the utterance of intolerant philosophies as long as we can counter them by rational argument and keep them in check by public opinion. Suppression would certainly be unwise. So he does start off giving that framework of, look, if you can use the abilities of rational argument, persuasion to lead people away from intolerant beliefs, that should happen. And I agree with him that way. I think that, primarily we should be, engaging in debate, educating people, and in a perfect world, the correct rational argument would rise to the top, and the one that is less logical, less rational, would sink below. The problem is I don't think we live in that perfect world. And when you have a breakdown of what rational argument is, and we're at a breakdown of we can't even agree on the original facts to then base our arguments off of, then you get to this point where it doesn't matter the level of rational argument. It doesn't matter how good or well eloquently you put your argument and how correct it is. Some people are just not going to buy it. We talked about last week about QAnon. This is a conspiracy theory that has been rapidly growing, sometimes in the 100% increase of followers on social media in the last few months. And it's completely based off of falsehoods, right? A satanic cabal has a pedophile ring to, drink children's blood. I mean, ridiculousness. And I think those people are the examples of those that are, beyond rational argument. They are beyond the basis of facts we can pull from, right? If we have a pool of facts, we can look at the facts and then come to different conclusions. But if you can't even agree on that original pool of facts, you're beyond this idea of, we can just use rational argument to then, suppress this intolerance. These people are now shown to become violent. And so I think that we have to go to the next stage with an example like QAnon, at least. You go to the next stage where he says this, but we should claim the right to suppress them if necessary, even by force. For it may easily turn out that they are not prepared to meet us on the level of rational argument, but begin by denouncing all argument. They may forbid their followers to listen to rational argument. Don't listen to the fake news. Everyone out there is lying. If someone has a change in opinion, they've been bought out. They're a shill. Because it's deceptive, and teach them to answer arguments by using their fists or pistols. So this is where it's like, you see a lot of people on the right criticize the left, saying, this paradox, you can't even be tolerant because you need intolerance. You're against free speech. And then you see a lot of people on the left use this as an excuse to then, for cancel culture, because we can't tolerate any kind of intolerance. It's really hard. It's really hard to narrow down exactly where the boundaries of this idea lies. But I do think it's important to remember that part of this theory involves maintaining the right to rid intolerance by force if rational argument does not prevail. And I think that's really interesting and poignant.
And I think this goes back to how complicated this thought experiment, which I'm going to kind of use as the way I'm going to term this from now on, is that I think it depends on the health of your society and the health of your country.
Right.
Because that's the problem here, man, is like, I do fear that, having the ability to rid thoughts could be dangerous or beneficial, right? Like, it really depends on kind of where your society's at. And, obviously Karl Popper did write this, and it needs to be known that this whole paradox of tolerance was basically a footnote or kind of an asterisk in this piece. So it was not what he was focused on.
No.
But it also did come out in 1945, like you said, during a time when we'd seen hyper anti-Semitism and hyper division. And so obviously he was coming from a very certain context to this. But the scary thing is that I think actually the United States is going right now down a very similar path, is that we are so hyper divided. And like you're talking about QAnon, which is a great example of this, is that We are getting to a point like that because, 10 years ago, something like QAnon would be easily condemned.
Right.
But like you said, I actually don't think it's really possible anymore. I mean, you and I had that video, and I've even seen on Facebook, we've had some people just completely and rightfully so condemn it, and other people say, well, it's just the same as all these other movements, which it's not. And that's where you kind of have to say that, yes, I think dangerous ideas like this are what start the next step of maybe eroding your democracy. And there's Michael Rosenfield, who in the Harvard Law Review in 1987 stated, start quotes, "It seems contradictory to extend freedom of speech to extremists who, if successful, ruthlessly suppress the speech of those with whom they disagree," which you were talking about. And I think we're almost to that point now, sadly, that both sides, especially the right now, see hateful speech as just like part of society. And yes, there's always going to be the hateful. This has got to such a different extent that I worry that it's kind of just the beginning of the intolerant getting rid of the tolerant here. But my issue is not as much about that. It's more about how we're framing the problem and how we're going to deal with the problem, right? Like, I think a lot of us want to say, how do we stop hate speech? It's the how question.
Yeah.
I think we need to be asking, why does it happen? And why do we still subscribe to it? And the United Nations actually put out a kind of disturbing paper called the United Nations Strategy and Plan of Action Towards Hate Speech. And, like we talked about even last week, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that around the world we are seeing a disturbing, rise of xenophobia, racism, and intolerance. But he says basically he puts out recommendations for how to deal with this. And it's very low on actually implementing policy to deal with it. It's more trying to understand maybe where this is coming from, between social media, fringe movements. And I think that's the problem here, is that if we try to just use policy to suppress the problem, it's probably just going to breed more of it. And that's where I still subscribe to more of the libertarian argument that sometimes just policy is not enough to solve it. We need to actually look into why. And I kind of went back to, it depends on the healthier society. I do think that there are parallels between the pre-Nazi, Holocaust Germany, where there was almost a breakdown of kind of limits on what you can do and what you can say and what is acceptable to say. And so that's why I'm more curious about why these movements even begin in the first place, rather than how we stop them.
I mean, that's a really good point, right? Why do people get into hate groups in the first, usually, I've watched a lot of documentaries about, the Ku Klux Klan in today's context, and neo-Nazi groups, and why do young white men primarily, and young white women, but primarily young white men, why do they get involved? How do they get involved in these groups? How do they fall down that rabbit hole? And a lot of it is, they start with a rough home life. They start with, a lack of identity, a lack of a community to belong to, and they end up finding that community and belonging in a hate group. That can persuade them of a worldview that they maybe didn't think of before. So, sure, you're right that that's a good point. Is how do we even stop people from going down the hateful rabbit hole anyway? But the reality is, even if you have a healthy society, you're still going to have some people that are just nuts and hateful. And I also think with social media, they have a megaphone. We've talked about time and time again. Again with deplatforming and. It's been brought up multiple times as what is social media's role in the spread of misinformation, the spread of hate speech, and I think it was this NPR bit where they talked to let me see right here, Charles Asher Small, who founded the Yale Initiative for the Interdisciplinary Study of Anti-Semitism, and he talked about how social media has been a promoter of democracy around the world and allowed for Arab Spring to happen and people to voice their opinions for a better world. And then on top of that, things like Facebook have also led to genocides happening in Myanmar and being exacerbated by misinformation. And he says, there is a balance we can find, right? It doesn't this idea of going against being intolerant of intolerance doesn't just immediately mean you have draconian laws. The idea that it's all free speech or nothing. It's a bifurcation that I don't think is helpful for the discussion. I think you can live in a free society that that can have limitations on what you can say about people's, race, religion, and creed, right? Again, you mentioned that the United States is actually more of the exception than the rule when it comes to hate speech policy, and that other countries like Canada, Germany, France, the UK have more stricter, rules against what you can say, and that's actually what this was brought up. I guess the designer John Galliano had an anti-Semitic outburst, and now he's being, put up for 6 months in prison and fined $31,000. He said things like, I like Hitler, all of your Jew ancestors would be gassed, and now he's getting fined for it and actually, jail time. In the United States, that would not happen. It would only be considered, we do have a little bit of a thing when it's involved in a violent act, right? If you attack someone and then you explicitly express that you attack that person for their race or gender or, creed, that's a hate crime. But hate speech on its own is not illegal. I don't think that Canada and France are not free societies. Now, of course, everything's a little bit different, but like Canada, in my opinion, is a free democracy that's functioning, and they have stricter laws on hate speech. So the idea, like the criticism that going down this route will then completely eradicate the First Amendment and then you can't criticize anybody, that's ridiculous. But it is worth noting. I think it is worth noting who decides what intolerance is, because sure, we can always bring up the example of the Nazis, right? That's so easy, right? Of course,
Easy, yeah.
Of course, yeah. They wanted to commit genocide on Jews and others, including LGBTQ people. That's pretty obviously bad. But let's say you have just in a scenario where, someone of a religious faith doesn't want their children to be in a homosexual marriage, right, because of their religious beliefs. Is that then, who decides? Is that past the line of intolerance where like, lock them up or whatever? Or is that within the idea of, no, that's not an opinion I agree with, but it's something that, he should be free to express and say? It does get murky. Of course, it's who decides what intolerance is. So, that's why this one is so difficult, because people love to just go one way or completely the other way. And I think we have to find a balance.
Yeah, I mean, I've said this now a couple times, but again, I truly subscribe to it depends on the health of the society we're talking about. And, like, just to be the devil's advocate for a minute, the issue I do sometimes have with this is that in the UK, I forget the specific case, but there's been, I think, 2 or 3 comedians who have actually had, like, not only jail sentences, but large and expensive fines for making an anti-Semitic joke on stage. And, that's the thing, is that I think sometimes, depending on the society, the place you're at, and kind of the context of the moment, sometimes there does become this muddled area of, and do you allow someone say something controversial that is horrible but is contextually different than actually wanting harm on people? And that does get complicated, but obviously that's a case-by-case basis. But I do know the UK has extremely strict hate speech laws, and there have been times when very safe and benevolent comedians all of a sudden see themselves completely blackballed from every possible part of society. And I also don't think that is correct either. But again, that's more of the exception than the rule. And that NPR interview you were talking about, I love the line where it was, we know from the history of anti-Semitism, for example, that anti-Semitism begins with Jews, but it never ends with Jews. And that once this hatred is unleashed on society, other marginalized groups become the victims as well. And that goes back to kind of the toad or the frog in boiling water, right? Sometimes all this is happening around you and you don't even notice it until it's too late, until you're cooked. And that's what happened in Nazi Germany. And I think a lot of people really want to jump to that on a lot of occasions, but we're not quite there yet. We are not quite there yet. But it is true that the case of the US, I do worry, because I think that, like, one of our biggest strengths is also one of our biggest weaknesses, which is the fact that we do allow close to unbridled free speech. And there are so many positives to that.
Yes.
There's also serious negatives.
Yes.
And I would honestly, I want to turn this political for a minute, because last night I watched the first night of the RNC. And I know that Republicans say that Biden is the Trojan horse for socialism and Marxism. But I can't help but wonder if Trump's rhetoric on, allowing free speech and how the Democrats want to take it away is actually a Trojan horse for allowing hate. And that's one of my biggest worries, is that because the US is just allows speech to go so unchecked, it would actually allow for someone to do bad things with their power. And I'm not totally saying that's Trump, but I'm saying that currently the trajectory of where speech is going in the US could get that far. And I mean, we had Donald Trump Jr. last night saying stuff like Joe Biden and the radical left are now coming for our freedom of speech and want to bully us into submission. If they get their way, we're not going to be the silent majority. We'll be the silenced majority. And honestly, I'm okay with silencing some of the speech when it's like Jews will not replace us. I think that contextually, you should allow people to say that. But in the context of where the United States is right now and this rising anti-Semitism worldwide, that does need to be stopped. But that's the complicated thing again, is that I don't know if the federal government has the ability or the efficacy to actually do anything about it. And so that does kind of create, in my opinion, somewhat of a catch-22 of what do you do?
Right. Well, so we actually have some comments here in the Twitch chat. I wanted to address those because they're pretty good. Ghost of the Valley here says, at least in my opinion, no matter how offensive the speech, it should be able to be voiced and shut down in a healthy, productive way, instead of with threats of persecution and violence. So certainly, even Karl Popper has mentioned that, the liberal, not liberal as in, democratic, donkey liberal, but liberals in classical liberal society. He says the liberal should leave violence for as an absolute last resort. It's the illiberal ideologues that resort to violence way quicker. So that's a very good point. Yes, without threats of persecution and violence should be last. So what are the driving forces that you can shut down intolerance, right? We talked about a little bit about policy and how the U.S. and the EU differ on some of their hate speech policy. But it's also, like Ghost of the Valley here says, it should be voiced and shut down in a healthy, productive way. Shut down by the public with rational argument. The problem is, which I mentioned earlier, is that rational argument doesn't always work. And I think this is where cancel culture comes in. And believe me, there's a lot of problems with cancel culture, and things get taken out of context and people get their whole lives destroyed over something that maybe didn't deserve that. But in a sense, if we're looking at this philosophy, cancel culture is the sociological way to deal with intolerance that doesn't require a government action, right? It's not, cancel culture is not based off of the government is forcing you to get fired. It's that the employer makes a decision. I don't think we don't want to hire this person because of the intolerance that they promote, or the the impopularity of their speech. So it's in a weird way, the whole cancel culture and that kind of social, what's the word? Accountability is one way that you can combat intolerance without using government policy.
Yeah. Yeah, and no, I would agree with that. And I would go even a little bit more towards that and say I saw an interesting article from the Charles Koch Institute. So obviously there's Charles Koch, I think we all know where the Koch brothers, align politically. But I do want to say that actually the Koch brothers are not, big arbitrators of, hateful speech or anything. They're just libertarians and, big business, business over everything. But they had an interesting article called "Should We Tolerate Intolerance?" And they use a really interesting point, which actually triggers a lot of other things I've been thinking about, which is the director, D.W. Griffith. For those of you who don't know, he had the 1915 movie Birth of a Nation, which was extremely racist. It glorified the KKK and arguably actually slowed down a lot of Reconstruction and allowed kind of a resurgence of racism in the United States. And it's also, though, heralded as one of the biggest groundbreaking movies that kind of set the stage for silent film in Hollywood. And now the year after 1915, he put out another film called Intolerance. And this movie focused on 4 stories of persecution, Jesus being one of them. And a lot of people think this was a response to his movie, The Birth of a Nation. And he kind of had this Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde kind of style of making movies. And this was a racist man, a very flawed man. And I actually see a lot of positives actually out of this example, is because what this Koch article says is we don't need to outlaw hate speech or intolerant speech. We need to stigmatize it and make sure and put an asterisk next to what this is and how bad it can be. And that's kind of how D.W. Griffith has been portrayed through history, is that, yes, he was influential in the early days of Hollywood, and his movie-making style was crucial to kind of the evolution of Hollywood and where movies are going to go. But also, he might have arguably caused a resurgence of the KKK and somewhat made a KKK recruiting video. And so there's an asterisk next to him. He's been stigmatized. People now talk about that movie in kind of a lens of impassionate hatred. And I guess my point here is that we need to find a way to stigmatize hate but not get rid of it, because I do think that if you just don't and just get rid of it, it does go to the creepy corners of the internet. And I know you and I've talked about this many times before. I just think stigmatize, not ban.
Right. Okay. But I think the issue then you have then is like that's what we're seeing today. Is we're seeing people stigmatize hate, and then the reaction is then that I've seen from the right is that they feel that they can't say anything without being called a racist. They feel that they can't say anything without being called a homophobe. And then again, I'm back to that.
Well, then don't be a racist.
Well, yeah, but that's the issue, right? Is like I agree. I agree that we should stigmatize, hateful behavior as much as possible. It should be called out because first of all, not all ideas are equal. Some ideas are good and some ideas are stupid, and they should be called out that way. And I think racist ideas and intolerant ideas are stupid, and they're not on the equal level. Like I'm not going to treat them as like that's another valid academic argument that you hate all Jews. Like no, that's not a valid academic argument. And so I definitely think that that stigmatization is a valid way to combat intolerance. However, the problem still then arises is what behavior is worth being stigmatized for and what isn't, especially when you do get into, religious differences, political differences. Because again, what I may believe something that I think is benign, like, I believe in, I'm kind of left-leaning and I believe in kind of left-leaning stuff. Someone else may take that as my beliefs are actively destroying America. They may view my beliefs as intolerant to their free way of life. So then, do they get again? It's still so hard because who defines what intolerance is? I mean, again, like look at the United States with communism. In the middle of the 20th century, you were jailed. You were jailed if you were a communist because people thought that political ideology was such an affront to their way of life. They believed that communism was intolerant to the American capitalist system, and in ways it is. So I don't know. It's so hard. It's so hard to find that idea of like, yes, we need to stigmatize hateful speech. We need to call out people for intolerance. But then again, it's how far does that go? Like I believe all that until then someone may view something I say as intolerant, and then suddenly I'm the victim of the stigmatization where I don't feel I deserve it. It's just hard. It's just hard to find that balance.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a very fair point. And I mean, one remedy I would give, and this is something that wouldn't have worked back in the D.W. Griffith days, but it would be fact checking. I think in a lot of ways, fact checking could be one of the best forms of stigmatization. More in the fact that it adds an asterisk to whatever you think is fact. And obviously that's not going to work for everyone, but it does make ideas look not credible. Like I actually noticed on one of our videos, or our video last week for QAnon, YouTube now actually has a little thing below it that has a Wikipedia page definition of what QAnon is, informing people before they even click on our video what we're going to be talking about. And I think that's where this is obviously a luxury that we have now, like I said, that isn't before, but maybe just the fact that social media sites do need to be more involved in the content that is on their pages. And I don't think that's inherently limiting free speech if it's done correctly. But, I mean, we've talked about this before when the Twitter fight with Trump was happening. They don't need to ban Trump. They just need to add an asterisk or a red line that talks about maybe what he said isn't true. And I know media sites do this, and we're starting to see social media do this. I think that's one way. Don't, in the old definition, stigmatize it by saying, oh, these are all idiots, because all that's going to do is just make them more enraged and embattled in their position. But what we can do is, if you're maybe one of those people who's not off into the deep end yet, maybe you see that and think, well, maybe this idea, at least there's an asterisk to it. I think there's things we can do, especially with the amount of technology we have.
Right. Well, I mean, again, I mean, I look, I'm always hopeful that the idea of that the most rational and best argument will float to the top. But I just worry that that's not what I've been seeing lately. I've been seeing, I've been seeing people jump to conclusions, jump to generalizations. I've been seeing people, have opinions that are not based on facts, and then running with it, and then coming back and when they get facts, they say, no, that's a lie, or no, that's, that was bought out or shilled, or disingenuous. And so it's just so hard for me to maintain my hope in the idea that the most rational argument wins when I don't see people rationally arguing.
Well, this is kind of an adjacent thing. This is just a question to you. I don't expect us to solve this here, but what do you think about, say, comments? Well, for example, last night in the RNC, where you had even people like Nikki Haley say this is not a racist country. And you had other people say that Joe Biden is the equivalent of Fidel Castro. And you had other people say that Democrats literally want to burn down the capitalist country. Like, that, in my opinion, somewhat is like the predecessor to intolerant speech. Like, do you think there needs to be limits on allowing an entire party's convention to spread falsehoods like that?
Well, certainly you can't. Gosh.
Sorry, that's a heavy question, but
I mean, practically, there's no way, right? There's no way you can, there's no way that you would, if a party in power, let's say the Democrats do take power, the party in power then limits what the RNC can even talk about. I mean, that's a shit show. I mean, no one is gonna. That just emboldens the idea of an autocratic left. No, but I mean, I don't know.
They fact check it? Do they maybe, I don't know, put an asterisk?
Yeah, well, they do. I mean, they did. There was live fact checking from MSNBC. The problem is people don't trust MSNBC. Again, people don't trust the fact checkers as legitimate, and vice versa, right? And vice versa. If there was any kind of fact checking from Fox News, people on the left would just immediately throw it away as disingenuous. So that's that problem again. It's like, I don't know. I don't know. We're starting to blend into that second clause of the paradox where he talks about how, it may easily turn out that they are not prepared to meet us on the level of rational argument, but begin by denouncing all argument. And I don't know. I'm just so scared that's where we're at. I hope we're not. I hope we're still at that point where the best idea floats to the top, and that fact-checking and, education can lead people back into an idea of rational argument. Not to the same opinions. I'm not talking about lead people to the same opinions, but lead people to the same basis of facts for them which you can construct a rational argument one way or another. But I don't see people there. I don't see people willing to do that. And I don't know, man. It's just tough. But I do think that there is a little bit of the paradox of tolerance that is true. I think you have to have at least some modicum of combating intolerance, whether that be social stigmatization or some policy, right? Not complete shutdown of free speech, of course, but maybe a little bit of a limit on some of the more radical extremist policies of speech. We have to have some kind of defense against intolerance, because if you don't, then intolerance just breeds more intolerance, and especially with social media, things that we would just consider to be the crazy nut job in a trailer park are now becoming, now elected officials are spouting some of these ideas.
Yeah, and I mean, that UN article I quoted earlier from the Secretary General said that hate speech has kind of hit the mainstream, and unfortunately, I think what Popper was talking about is slowly becoming true. Is the fact that that's when you start not tolerating intolerance, is when the intolerance is not a fringe anymore, but is actually part of the zeitgeist of a country. And I think, unfortunately, that is somewhat where we're at now, and that's probably warranting something to do. And that last comment from Ghost of the Valley that I see here, is the idea. Yeah, the person says here, I think that echo chamber mentality with people comes with the ease of enclosing yourself with people that hold similar ideas. And I mean, I don't know how to solve that, man. I almost think in some ways our society's freedom of discussion and our system of discourse is broken. It's sick.
Yeah.
And until we remedy it, I don't know if discussions will happen. So I'm not trying to be pessimistic, but I think it's looking bad. I do.
Yeah, we are definitely not at that era of like philosophers debating in the open forum, like that like idealistic view of philosophy, and like, oh, we're just like the Greeks, like battling of ideas. That's not what's happening in our country, in the United States today. We're not there. We are. It's two sides that are, like Ghost of the Valley mentioned. They enjoy being in the echo chamber.
It's kind of the race to the bottom with ideas, but
Anyhow, it's a tough topic. It's complex. But what do you think about the paradox of tolerance? Again, you can catch us live on Twitch, like some other people have here, and they were able to, put some live comments. Unfortunately, we can't get to all the live comments because we do kind of have a structure for our podcast, but we would love to take, we do like to take a couple and then see what you guys think. But as always, you can comment on our YouTube video. If you're watching the recorded version, find us on YouTube, Podbean, Apple Podcasts, and a slew of third-party sites that we've distributed to at the Tonic Accord. So thank you all for listening, and let us know what you think about the paradox of intolerance.